The date was December 7th, 1941, a morning that began with the tranquil pastels of a Hawaiian sunrise painting the sky over Oahu. The island was stirring to life, a peaceful Sunday that promised rest and recreation for the thousands of servicemen stationed there. At the Pearl Harbor Naval Base, the mighty Pacific Fleet lay at anchor, the calm waters of the harbor reflecting the slumbering giants of Battleship Row. In his quarters, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet, was preparing for a day that he hoped would involve a game of golf with his Army counterpart, General Walter Short. The two men had much to discuss, primarily the growing tensions with Japan and the increasing unease that had been settling over the Pacific like a dark cloud. But for now, the world was quiet. But just before 8 a.m., that quiet was shattered by the droning hum of aircraft. It was a sound familiar to the island, but these were not the expected B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland. As the first waves of Japanese Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and Nakajima B-5 and Kate torpedo bombers descended from the clouds, their rising sun insignia became horrifyingly clear. The initial explosions ripped through the air, giant plumes of smoke and fire erupting from the battleships USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, and USS West Virginia. The sky, once a canvas of blue and gold, turned black with oily smoke and filled with the shrieking hell of diving aircraft and the thunderous roar of high explosives. From the second floor of the submarine base headquarters, a building that offered a panoramic, albeit horrifying, view of Battleship Row, Admiral Kimmel watched the apocalypse unfold. He stood frozen for a moment, his face ashen, watching his beloved fleet being torn apart. The report of the attack had reached him via a telephone call from a neighbor, and he had rushed to this vantage point, arriving in time to see the USS Arizona take a direct hit that turned the great ship into a funeral pyre for over 1,000 of its crew. The acrid smell of smoke and cordite began to drift through the open window, a grim perfume for the carnage outside. Inside the headquarters, chaos reigned. Young sailors and officers scrambled, trying to make sense of the unbelievable, shouting into radios and telephones that were suddenly filled with panicked, fragmented reports. Kimmel, however, was a stark portrait of stillness amidst the madness. His jaw was set, had his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the destruction of his command. It was then that a new sound joined the cacophony, the sharp, distinctive rattle of heavy machine gun fire from directly below him. Sailors had managed to get a .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun operational and were pouring fire skyward at the swarming enemy planes. As Kimmel stood watching a Japanese plane streak low across the harbor, a piece of lead sent on its way by one of those gunners had a different destination in mind. A spent .50 caliber machine gun bullet, its energy nearly spent after its long arc back to Earth, or perhaps a ricocheting round, came through the open window of the command post. It flew past a desk, past a startled yeoman, and struck the Admiral squarely in the chest. The impact was a sharp, heavy thud. Everyone in the room froze, made their eyes wide with terror. For one horrific second, they believed their commanding officer had been shot by the enemy. Kimmel staggered back a half step, his hand flying to his chest. He looked down, expecting to see a spreading stain of blood. Instead, his fingers closed around a hot, jagged piece of metal. The bullet, its velocity spent, had lodged in the fabric of his khaki uniform shirt, burning his skin but failing to penetrate his chest. He pried the deformed chunk of lead from his shirt and held it in his palm, staring at it. The room was silent, the only sounds the distant explosions and gunfire from outside. He looked from the bullet in his hand back out the window at the burning wreckage of the Pacific Fleet. In that moment, the physical pain was nothing compared to the gut-wrenching agony of his professional and personal honor being torn to shreds. He turned the bullet over in his fingers, a tangible piece of the disaster that was engulfing him. Then, in a voice so low and thick with despair that those nearby had to strain to hear him, he uttered words that would become a haunting echo of that day's tragedy. "I wish it had killed me," he said. It was not a cry of cowardice, but the lament of a commander who felt the weight of every sunken ship, every burning sailor, every lost soul resting solely on his shoulders. He tossed the bullet onto a nearby desk, a metallic clink that sounded like a death knell, and turned back to the window. There was no time for self-pity, no time for wounds. The business of war demanded his attention. The story of that bullet, and however, was just one tiny, almost ironic detail in a day filled with epic tragedy and individual valor. While the Admiral watched his fleet die, a crucible of heroism was being forged in the fire and smoke below him, a testament to the unbreakable spirit of the American sailor. Out on the chaotic tarmac of Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay, the scene was one of desperate innovation. The Japanese Zeros had targeted the seaplane base with ruthless efficiency, leaving hangars ablaze and aircraft crumpled and burning. Among the men racing for cover and searching for any way to fight back was Yeoman First Class Kenton Nash. As he ran, he saw a sight that would stay with him forever. A lone sailor, armed only with his standard-issue .45 caliber pistol, had taken a defiant stance in the middle of the airfield. But with seemingly no regard for the strafing runs that were chewing up the concrete around him, he raised his sidearm and began firing at the enemy planes flashing overhead. It was an act of pure, unadulterated defiance, a mouse flipping off a hawk. Nash watched in disbelief, not just at the man's bravery, but at the result. As a Zero pulled out of a dive, its engines screaming, the sailor emptied his magazine. A thin trail of smoke suddenly began to stream from the enemy fighter. The plane wobbled, its flight path becoming erratic as it headed out to sea, leaving a dark smear across the blue sky. Nash was convinced, and would later recount, that the man's desperate pistol fire had somehow pierced the Zero's oil tank, sending it on its way to a probable crash. It was an impossible feat, a one-in-a-million shot, but in the madness of that morning, it happened. Not far away, another group of defenders armed themselves with weapons never designed for anti-aircraft work. Private Leslie LaFan of the Marine Barracks watched as two officers, a Marine and a naval officer, calmly walked onto the parade grounds. They were dressed in their service uniforms, not combat gear, and carried over their arms their personal automatic 12-gauge shotguns, along with satchels of ammunition. They had likely been preparing for a skeet shooting outing, a popular Sunday pastime. Now they stood in the open, with bullets and shrapnel whizzing past, loaded their scatterguns, and began firing at the Japanese planes. LaFan remembered thinking it was a futile gesture, wondering what a cloud of birdshot could possibly do to an all-metal warplane. Yeah, but he also understood the sentiment. A man had to do something. It was the last great act of defiance, a statement that even with inadequate tools, the spirit of the defender would not be broken. Perhaps the most famous story of heroism from that day was happening aboard the sinking USS West Virginia, a ship torn apart by torpedoes and bombs. In the smoke and darkness below decks, the crew fought a losing battle against fire and flood. Among them was a man who, by the Navy's restrictive regulations of the time, was assigned the lowly role of a mess attendant, responsible for serving officers their meals. His name was Doris Miller. As chaos erupted, Miller was ordered to the bridge to tend to the mortally wounded captain, Mervyn Bennion. After helping to move the captain to a less exposed position, Miller was called to a more urgent duty. An officer on the signal bridge spotted an unmanned .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun. He turned to the powerfully built Miller, who had no formal training on the weapon, and ordered him to help load it. Miller, however, didn't just load. He grabbed the heavy machine gun, a weapon designed for a crew, and opened fire on the attacking Japanese planes. With the ship listing badly and fires raging around him, the roar of the .50 caliber drowning out the screams and explosions, Miller poured a steady stream of lead into the sky. He fired until he ran out of ammunition, officially credited with downing at least one, possibly two, Japanese aircraft. He was a black man in a segregated navy, given a task no one else could perform, and he performed it with a ferocity and skill that would eventually earn him the Navy Cross, a medal pinned on him by Admiral Chester Nimitz, Kimmel's successor. His actions were a stark reminder that courage knows no rank or race. Back at the submarine base headquarters, the battle raged on. The initial wave of attackers was beginning to withdraw, but the damage was done. Admiral Kimmel remained at his post, refusing to take cover, refusing to leave his watch. He dictated orders, tried to make sense of the chaos, and began the long, agonizing process of trying to salvage something from the wreckage. He was still standing there when another officer, recognizing the profound injustice and tragedy of the moment, retrieved the spent bullet from the desk where Kimmel had tossed it. The officer slipped it into his pocket, keeping it as a silent, grim memento of the day their world changed, a token of a leader's broken heart. As the last Japanese planes disappeared over the horizon, the silence that returned to Pearl Harbor was worse than the noise. It was a silence filled with the crackle of fires, the groaning of sinking steel, the shouts of rescuers, and the cries of the wounded. Over 2,400 Americans were dead. The battleship fleet lay in ruins. Admiral Kimmel, the man who had been struck by a spent bullet from his own men's guns, would soon be relieved of his command, scapegoated for a disaster that was the result of failures far beyond his control. The bullet that failed to kill him became a dark symbol of his ordeal, a physical manifestation of the blame, the shame, and the profound sorrow he would carry for the rest of his life. But in the hearts of the men who fought that day, the story was different. It wasn't about the admirals and the generals and the failures of command. It was about the sailor with a pistol who may have downed a Zero, the officer's skeet shooting at warplanes, and the mess attendant who manned a machine gun and became a hero. Their courage, born in the smoke and fire of a day of infamy, was the true legacy of December 7th, a testament that even in the face of stunning defeat, the American spirit remained defiant and unbroken.